The story of Christianity in Brazil is a journey that spans centuries, filled with perseverance, passion, and transformation. From the moment Pedro Álvares Cabral planted a cross on Brazilian soil in 1500, the Christian faith has woven itself into the fabric of Brazilian society. What started as a Catholic mission evolved into a religious landscape shaped by the arrival of Protestant missionaries, the establishment of diverse Christian denominations, and the rise of Pentecostal and charismatic movements. This spiritual tapestry has not only influenced personal faith but has driven social, cultural, and even political transformations across the nation. Through each wave of missionaries and church founders, from the Jesuits to the Huguenots and the early Pentecostals, Christianity in Brazil has inspired both hope and challenge. As we dive into this rich history, let's explore how faith has shaped Brazilian identity and continues to impact the lives of millions today. If you're inspired by Brazil's unique spiritual history, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to join us on this journey of faith and discovery. The beginning of colonization and Roman Catholicism. The arrival of the Portuguese in Brazil marked the beginning of an era of deep religious influence, as Christianity became an integral part of the nation's foundation. When Pedro Álvares Cabral arrived in 1500, one of his first actions was to plant a cross on Brazilian soil, establishing both a territorial claim and a religious one. This symbolic gesture represented the intent to spread Catholicism among the indigenous people, marking the beginning of a relationship between faith and territory that would evolve significantly over the centuries. Following Cabral's arrival, the first Mass in Brazil was celebrated by Friar Henrique de Coimbra, reinforcing the Catholic Church's presence and setting a precedent for religious ceremonies in the New World. This initial act wasn't merely a ritual but a foreshadowing of the role that the Catholic Church would play in Brazilian society. Catholicism quickly became more than a set of beliefs. It was an institution through which Portugal sought to unify, educate, and convert the indigenous populations, drawing them into European cultural frameworks. In 1549, the arrival of the Jesuits marked a significant milestone in the Catholic mission. Led by Father Manuel de Nóbrega, these missionaries aimed to evangelize the native people and establish the Catholic faith firmly in the region. The Jesuits, members of the Society of Jesus, were known for their educational focus, creating schools and hospitals as they sought not only to convert but also to civilize according to European standards. This blend of religious, educational, and cultural influence helped shape early Brazilian society. One of the most influential Jesuits, Father José de Anchieta, arrived in Brazil in 1553, eventually becoming a symbol of Catholic dedication in the country. Anchieta founded several institutions, including the Santa Casa de Misericordia in Rio de Janeiro, which provided both medical care and spiritual guidance to the population. His efforts earned him widespread recognition, and he was later beatified by Pope John Paul II. Anchieta's influence was not only religious but also cultural, as he worked on linguistic studies and engaged directly with indigenous groups, merging religious zeal with a deep respect for local traditions. The Catholic Church's work, however, was not without controversy. While many indigenous people converted, others resisted what they perceived as an imposition of foreign beliefs and customs. The Jesuits often faced challenges in balancing their missionary goals with the indigenous population's cultural autonomy. Despite these conflicts, the Jesuit missions expanded, embedding Catholic practices and values deeply into Brazilian society. This period laid the foundation for Catholicism's lasting impact on Brazil's religious and social structure. Furthermore, the Jesuits became powerful political actors, using their influence to affect colonial policies and advocating for the protection of indigenous peoples from enslavement. Their authority sometimes clashed with that of local officials, creating a tension between the Crown's economic interests and the Church's religious mission. This tension reflected the complex relationship between church and state, a dynamic that would shape Brazil's religious landscape for generations. Through the Jesuits, the Catholic Church also influenced education, a tool used to promote religious instruction among the youth. Jesuit schools became a primary means of education, focusing on reading, writing, and religious studies. These institutions not only instilled Catholic doctrine but also introduced European customs and ideas, bridging cultural gaps but also imposing a foreign worldview. For many, this education represented an opportunity for advancement, while for others, it symbolized a loss of native identity. The Catholic influence was further solidified through rituals and festivals that became part of the local culture. Catholic feasts, saints' days, and religious holidays became central to Brazilian social life, fostering a sense of community and shared beliefs. The celebration of these events brought people together, blending European and indigenous traditions into a unique expression of Brazilian Catholicism that persists to this day. As Catholicism spread, the Church began to establish itself as a central institution within Brazilian communities, providing spiritual guidance and moral authority. This institutional strength allowed Catholicism to integrate deeply into both rural and urban settings, forming a cultural foundation that would influence Brazilian values, politics, and family life for centuries. The Catholic Church became not only a spiritual body but a social force, one that set the stage for a dominant religious culture in Brazil. Even today, the impact of early Catholic missions can be seen across Brazil, from the architecture of colonial churches to the religious customs still celebrated in communities large and small. The Catholic Church's early role in colonization left an indelible mark on Brazilian identity, one that would endure even as other religious movements, such as Protestantism, would later attempt to establish a foothold. This foundation of Catholic tradition, however, created a complex religious landscape, preparing Brazil for a multifaceted spiritual journey. Discovery of Brazil, 1500. Pedro Álvares Cabral plants a cross and celebrates the first Mass. When Pedro Álvares Cabral arrived on the shores of Brazil in April 1500, he and his crew made history by performing one of the first Christian rituals on Brazilian soil, the Massachusetts. This ceremony, led by Friar Henrique de Coimbra, served to consecrate the newly discovered land under the banner of Catholicism, symbolizing not only European territorial claims but also the intent to convert and influence the native population. The Mass represented a foundational act in the religious history of Brazil, setting the stage for Catholicism's powerful influence in the centuries to come. The planting of a cross on the beach where Cabral's fleet landed held symbolic weight, marking Brazil as a Christian territory and affirming Portugal's intention to instill Catholic beliefs among its people. This cross was not merely a religious icon but a sign of colonial authority, linking the success of Portugal's claim to a mission of religious conversion. To Cabral and his men, the act of worship was inseparable from their colonial objectives. They viewed faith as a unifying force that could both legitimize and strengthen their new dominion over Brazilian lands. This first Mass in Brazil was infused with spiritual and political significance, revealing the role Catholicism would play in the establishment of colonial rule. By invoking divine approval of their venture, Cabral and his men aligned their mission with the Catholic Church, setting a precedent for the alliance between the Portuguese crown and religious authorities in governing the new colony. This event foreshadowed the Catholic Church's long-standing influence over the social and moral structure of Brazil, where religious rites would come to symbolize loyalty to both faith and crown. The indigenous peoples who witnessed this ceremony likely viewed it with a mixture of curiosity and caution, as the rituals and symbols of Catholicism were entirely new. The Mass, though incomprehensible to native observers, introduced them to a religious worldview that would eventually be imposed upon their lands and lives. The Portuguese perceived their mission as a sacred duty to spread the true faith, often overlooking the indigenous people's existing beliefs. This cultural imposition would lay the groundwork for future interactions marked by tension, adaptation, and, at times, violence. As Catholicism spread among Brazil's native population, the act of religious conversion often meant the erasure of indigenous spiritual practices. To the colonizers, Catholicism was a tool of civilization, one that they believed would elevate native peoples by aligning them with European values. This perspective, however, ignored the deep spiritual heritage of Brazil's indigenous communities, leading to a form of cultural dominance where indigenous identities were pushed to conform to European norms. The Mass on the beach symbolized this shift, marking the beginning of religious transformation in Brazil. Over time, the celebration of the Mass would become a regular occurrence in the colony, as the Catholic Church built structures, missions, and schools. The initial ceremony set the tone for a hierarchical and centralized religious organization that would grow in power. Through the sacraments, the Church maintained influence over every major event in colonial life, from births and marriages to funerals. This institutional control extended beyond spiritual matters, as the Church's moral authority often intertwined with legal and social structures, shaping colonial governance. The Catholic Church also used rituals like the Mass as a way to bond diverse groups, fostering a unified Christian identity among the settlers. For the Portuguese, these celebrations created a collective sense of purpose rooted in shared beliefs. The presence of a visible religious institution helped solidify Catholicism's role in maintaining social order and reinforcing loyalty to both God and King. In this way, the Mass on Brazilian soil was a pivotal moment that foreshadowed the central role of religion in maintaining colonial stability. The first Mass also marked the beginning of Brazil's transformation into a land of the cross, a term symbolizing the way the Church would shape both the land and its people. The establishment of Catholicism became synonymous with European culture, impacting everything from language and customs to education and family structure. By converting Brazil into a Catholic territory, Cabral's fleet not only planted a cross but also the seeds of a social framework that would define Brazilian identity for generations. In retrospect, this first Mass is remembered as a critical starting point in the blending of faith with colonial authority. The cross on Brazilian soil signified more than a symbol of faith. It represented the beginning of a cultural fusion that would lead to a unique blend of European and indigenous customs within the Catholic Church in Brazil. This dynamic interplay between faith and cultural identity laid the foundation for a multifaceted society, where Catholicism would serve as both a spiritual compass and a means of cultural unification. This historical act, combining faith, power, and colonization, created a legacy that continues to shape Brazil's religious identity. The establishment of Catholicism in Brazil, symbolized by that first Mass, set in motion a profound transformation, not only of individual lives but of the nation's very soul. The presence of Catholicism in Brazil grew from these early acts of ritual and colonization, influencing every facet of Brazilian culture and preparing the way for the growth and evolution of Christianity within the nation. Arrival of the Jesuits, 1549, establishing Roman Catholicism in Brazil. In 1549, the arrival of the Jesuits marked a new chapter in the Catholic Church's mission to Brazil. Led by Father Manuel de Nóbrega, these missionaries were driven by the conviction that the indigenous population needed salvation, and they saw themselves as spiritual guides. The Jesuits aimed to evangelize and convert native Brazilians to Catholicism, initiating a widespread religious mission that would reshape Brazilian society. The Society of Jesus, known for its intellectual rigor and educational focus, was well prepared to lead this ambitious project. One of the Jesuits' primary strategies involved creating missions, or reductions, where indigenous people could live and learn under the guidance of the priests. These missions were established as safe spaces, often protecting indigenous communities from slavery and exploitation. In return, the Jesuits expected that indigenous people would accept Catholic teachings, thereby promoting a structured, disciplined, and religious way of life. The missions became centers for both religious and cultural exchange, influencing language, education, and community practices in profound ways. The Jesuits' educational efforts played a central role in their mission, as they taught reading, writing, and religious doctrine to the indigenous population. Education was a crucial tool for the Jesuits, who believed that by teaching the fundamentals of Christianity, they could help native Brazilians embrace Catholic values. The curriculum extended beyond basic literacy to include moral instruction and social responsibilities, aiming to produce devout Catholics who adhered to European social norms. This educational approach became the cornerstone of Jesuit influence throughout Brazil. A figure who stands out in the Jesuit mission is Father José de Anchieta, a Spanish-born priest who arrived in Brazil in 1553. Anchieta dedicated his life to working with indigenous communities, founding schools and writing plays in native languages to aid in conversion efforts. His understanding and respect for indigenous culture allowed him to approach evangelism with a unique sensitivity. Anchieta's work left a lasting legacy in Brazil, earning him sainthood and an enduring reputation as one of the nation's foundational religious figures. Anchieta also contributed to linguistic studies, producing works in Tupi, the language spoken by many indigenous people in Brazil. By engaging directly with the language and culture of those he sought to convert, he helped bridge cultural divides that otherwise hindered communication. His work in translation and education became instrumental in advancing the Jesuit mission, fostering a sense of mutual respect that was rare in the colonial era. Anchieta's approach represented a blend of dedication to Catholic ideals and genuine compassion for indigenous cultures. The Jesuits' presence did not come without conflict, however. Their advocacy for the protection of indigenous people often clashed with Portuguese settlers' economic interests, especially as the demand for labor grew. While the Jesuits saw their mission as protecting souls, many colonists viewed indigenous people as a labor resource. This tension between religious and economic interests led to friction, as some colonial leaders resented Jesuit interference in their control over native labor. The Jesuits' influence, therefore, was not only spiritual but also political, shaping debates over the ethics of colonization. In addition to evangelism, the Jesuits provided essential social services. They founded schools, hospitals, and shelters, helping to meet the needs of both indigenous and settler populations. By establishing the Santa Casa de Misericordia and other charitable institutions, the Jesuits cemented their role as community leaders. These institutions not only provided physical care but also reinforced the Catholic Church's moral authority in Brazilian society, making the Jesuits indispensable to the colony's social structure. The Jesuit missions also brought elements of European art, music, and theater into indigenous communities, creating a fusion of cultural expressions. Rituals and performances became tools for both education and worship, allowing the Jesuits to teach religious values in ways that resonated with native traditions. This cultural blending was a hallmark of Jesuit evangelism, as they sought to make Catholicism accessible and appealing to those unfamiliar with its teachings. In many ways, the Jesuit missions became places of cultural hybridization, where European and indigenous influences merged. Despite their achievements, the Jesuits faced significant opposition, both from colonial authorities and other Catholic orders. Their emphasis on indigenous welfare was often viewed as an obstacle to colonial expansion, and tensions arose over their influence in policy matters. As the Jesuits' power grew, so did the resentment against them, culminating in their eventual expulsion from Brazil in the 18th century. However, their legacy endured, as the values they promoted had already taken root in Brazilian society. The arrival of the Jesuits in Brazil in 1549, therefore, had a transformative impact that extended far beyond their religious mission. Their contributions to education, cultural preservation, and social welfare left an indelible mark on Brazilian society. Though their mission ultimately faced challenges, the Jesuits succeeded in establishing Catholicism as a defining element of Brazilian culture, a legacy that would shape the nation's religious identity well into the future. Enjoying the story of Christianity's impact in Brazil? Give this video a thumbs up and leave a comment with your thoughts or questions. Father José de Anchieta, 1553, founding of Santa Casa de Misericordia and Beatification. In 1553, Father José de Anchieta, a Jesuit priest deeply committed to the mission in Brazil, arrived and began to establish a legacy that would endure for centuries. Known for his devotion to both spiritual and humanitarian causes, Anchieta played a critical role in shaping Brazil's religious and cultural landscape. One of his first significant acts was to establish the Santa Casa de Misericordia in Rio de Janeiro, a charitable institution designed to provide medical care and assistance to those in need. This hospital not only fulfilled the Church's mandate of charity, but also set a standard for compassion and service that resonated with local communities. The founding of Santa Casa de Misericordia marked a milestone in Brazilian history, as it became one of the earliest centers of public health care in the region. Anchieta's vision extended beyond religious instruction. He aimed to meet the practical needs of the community by establishing a place of healing and care. In a time when medical facilities were scarce, the Santa Casa represented a lifeline, embodying the Catholic Church's commitment to the well-being of both settlers and indigenous people. This institution helped cement the Church's role as a pillar of support in Brazilian society. Anchieta's work was not limited to healthcare. He also dedicated himself to educating indigenous Brazilians, learning their languages and translating religious texts to facilitate understanding. His approach to evangelism was unique for his time, as he showed a deep respect for the native culture and sought to build bridges rather than force assimilation. By learning and writing in Tupi, a primary indigenous language, he demonstrated a willingness to adapt Catholic teachings in ways that resonated with native traditions. This cultural sensitivity enabled Anchieta to make meaningful connections and foster a spirit of cooperation with indigenous communities. In his writings, Anchieta documented the life and beliefs of the indigenous people, creating records that preserved aspects of native culture while introducing Catholic ideas. His contributions as a writer, particularly his religious plays, were instrumental in communicating the teachings of Christianity. These performances blended elements of indigenous storytelling with Christian narratives, creating a shared cultural experience that was both educational and spiritual. Anchieta's efforts in cultural preservation reflect a nuanced understanding of how faith could coexist with local traditions, rather than merely replacing them. Anchieta's influence extended well beyond his lifetime, as his contributions to Brazilian society and culture were later recognized by the Catholic Church. In 1980, Pope John Paul II beatified Anchieta, officially acknowledging his dedication and sacrifice. This beatification served as a reminder of the significant role he played in spreading Catholicism in Brazil, as well as his commitment to serving humanity. Anchieta's life of compassion and service became a model for future missionaries and solidified his place as a revered figure in Brazil's religious history. Anchieta's legacy as an educator also left a lasting impact on Brazil's educational system. He founded numerous schools where he taught reading, writing, and religious doctrine, laying the groundwork for formal education in Brazil. These schools emphasized discipline, morality, and devotion to God, instilling Catholic values in young minds. Ankita believed that education was a path to spiritual and personal growth, and his schools became places where students could learn not only about religion but also about social responsibility and community values. The Jesuit schools established by Ankita and his peers became known for their rigorous curriculum, preparing students for various roles in colonial society. By combining religious instruction with practical education, these institutions helped cultivate a literate and disciplined populace. Ankita's vision for education extended beyond the Jesuit missions, as many of his methods were later adopted by secular schools throughout Brazil. His influence on education underscored the Church's role in shaping the moral and intellectual foundation of Brazilian society. Ankita's work also influenced the development of charity and philanthropy in Brazil. The Santa Casa da Misericordia served as an example of the Church's dedication to public welfare, inspiring similar charitable institutions across the colony. By addressing the needs of the poor and vulnerable, Ankita demonstrated that the Church's mission encompassed both spiritual and material support. His legacy in this area helped establish a culture of charity that remains a core value in Brazilian religious communities. Through his dedication to the indigenous people, Ankita became a symbol of compassion and understanding. His work in learning indigenous languages and customs made him an advocate for intercultural dialogue and mutual respect. Ankita's willingness to engage with native traditions allowed him to communicate Catholic teachings in a way that honored local beliefs, fostering a spirit of inclusivity that was rare for his time. His approach to mission work exemplified the idea that faith could be shared without erasing the cultural identities of those he served. Today, Father José de Ankita is celebrated as one of Brazil's most influential religious figures, his contributions remembered as foundational to the country's cultural and religious identity. His beatification reflects the enduring impact of his life's work, inspiring both Catholics and non-Catholics alike with his commitment to charity, education, and intercultural respect. Ankita's legacy lives on in Brazilian society, where the values he promoted continue to shape the nation's approach to faith, education, and community service. The first attempt to establish Protestantism in Brazil. In 1555, a French expedition led by Nicolas Durand de Villegagnon arrived in Rio de Janeiro with the intention of establishing a Protestant colony. Villegagnon, a Huguenot with connections to the Reformation in Europe, sought a haven where Protestants could worship freely, away from Catholic persecution. This first attempt to introduce Protestantism to Brazil was unique and ambitious, as Villegagnon invited missionaries directly from Geneva, requesting the support of John Calvin, one of the Reformation's leading figures. Calvin responded by sending a group of Reformed pastors, marking the beginning of Protestant efforts in Brazil. When the French missionaries arrived in 1557, they faced an environment largely dominated by Catholic influence and unfamiliar with Reformed theology. Nevertheless, the missionaries persevered, conducting the first Protestant worship services and celebrating the Lord's Supper on Brazilian soil. This event marked a historic moment, symbolizing the arrival of Protestantism in South America. However, the lack of resources, cultural misunderstandings, and language barriers made it difficult for the missionaries to establish a stable community, highlighting the challenges of introducing a new faith to unfamiliar territory. The tensions between Villegagnon and the Calvinist missionaries quickly escalated, as they held differing theological views and struggled to cooperate. Villegagnon, though sympathetic to the Reformation, began to question the Calvinist doctrine, eventually turning against the missionaries he had invited. This division weakened the Protestant presence, and Villegagnon soon betrayed the Calvinist pastors, leading to their imprisonment and, for some, execution. This betrayal not only dismantled the first Protestant mission in Brazil, but also served as a stark reminder of the risks involved in religious dissent. The execution of several Calvinist missionaries was a sobering moment for the Reformed Church and hindered the spread of Protestantism in Brazil for many years. These martyrs became symbolic of the sacrifices made by early Protestant pioneers, but their deaths underscored the immense difficulty of establishing Protestant communities in a predominantly Catholic colony. The French experiment in Rio de Janeiro highlighted the obstacles that Protestantism would face in Brazil, where Catholicism held both spiritual and political authority. Despite its failure, this initial attempt paved the way for future Protestant missions by introducing Reformed theology to Brazilian shores. Though short-lived, the presence of the Calvinist missionaries demonstrated that there was a possibility, however remote, for religious diversity in Brazil. Their efforts planted seeds that, while dormant for a time, would later contribute to the eventual growth of Protestantism in the region. This early mission set a precedent for future Protestant missionaries who would later arrive in Brazil under more favorable conditions. In addition to the theological conflicts, the French Protestant mission also exposed cultural and political challenges that would affect later missionary efforts. The indigenous people, already influenced by Catholic Jesuits, found the Calvinist practices unfamiliar and were hesitant to engage with this new form of Christianity. The mission's failure highlighted the importance of cultural sensitivity and adaptation, lessons that future Protestant missions would consider in their efforts to reach the Brazilian people. Villagagnin's betrayal also underscored the complex nature of religious alliances during this period. Though aligned with the Protestant cause, Villagagnin's wavering commitment revealed how political considerations often influenced religious affiliations. His decision to abandon the Calvinists illustrated the precariousness of early Protestant efforts and the difficulties of maintaining unity in a foreign and hostile environment. This betrayal became a cautionary tale, reflecting the fragile nature of religious coalitions in a time of intense ideological conflict. The legacy of this failed mission lingered, as Protestantism would not take root in Brazil again until the arrival of other European groups centuries later. The deaths of the Calvinist missionaries served as a somber reminder of the challenges Protestantism faced in Catholic-dominated regions. However, their sacrifices were not forgotten, and they became symbols of faithfulness for later Protestant communities who would remember their commitment and determination despite persecution. The initial attempt to establish Protestantism in Brazil ultimately ended in failure, yet it represented a critical moment in the country's religious history. It exposed both the potential and the limitations of religious plurality in Brazil and set the stage for future Protestant efforts. This period demonstrated the need for resilience, adaptability, and unity among religious reformers, lessons that would prove valuable as Protestantism slowly gained a foothold in Brazil over the centuries. Today, the legacy of this first Protestant mission can be seen in the diverse Christian landscape of Brazil. The challenges faced by these early missionaries highlighted the resilience required to introduce new religious ideas, laying the foundation for a pluralistic society where various Christian denominations coexist. Although this first attempt ended in persecution, it ignited a spark that would eventually lead to the growth and expansion of Protestantism in Brazil. The history of Christianity in Brazil invites us to reflect on how faith can transform lives, foster community, and inspire resilience, even in the face of adversity. From early missionaries who risked everything to plant the seeds of belief, to the spread of Protestant and Pentecostal movements, the influence of Christianity has left an undeniable mark on Brazilian culture. As this legacy unfolds, we can ask ourselves, how can we carry forward this spirit of faith and transformation in our own lives? What values can we draw from this legacy to strengthen our communities today? If this journey through Brazil's spiritual history has sparked your interest, stay connected with us as we continue exploring the rich, diverse faith traditions that shape who we are. Want to keep learning about the history of faith and culture in Brazil? Subscribe to our channel and be the first to know about our latest videos.